Katie Morgan floated in the darkness of space and watched her damaged scout ship drift further away, while her emergency beacon blinked its useless signal into the void because no human vessel was within 100 light years of her position, and she knew she had maybe 6 hours of oxygen left in her suit. The mission had been simple enough when it started 3 days ago, and Command had asked her to map the edge of Krillian space and gather intelligence about their fleet movements. But nobody had mentioned the gravity mines that would tear her ship apart the moment she crossed the invisible border. She closed her eyes and tried not to think about dying alone in the cold between stars when suddenly her radio crackled to life, and a voice spoke in accented but clear English asking if she required assistance. And Katie almost laughed because requiring assistance was the understatement of the century. The ship that emerged from nowhere was unlike anything in the human databases, and it shimmered like oil on water with colors that hurt to look at directly. And Katie felt herself being pulled inside by some kind of gravity beam that was impossibly gentle for alien technology. The airlock pressurized around her, and Katie expected to meet soldiers with weapons, but instead, there was a single figure waiting, and she had 4 arms and skin that seemed to contain tiny stars, and eyes that were larger than any human eyes, but somehow kind. Princess Zalara had never seen a human before except in the intelligence reports that called them primitive and weak. But the creature standing before her in the damaged environment suit did not look weak, and instead looked determined. Despite facing certain death moments ago, Katie removed her helmet because the air reading showed it was safe, and she met the alien princess eyes without flinching and said, "Thank you for saving her life." And Zalara tilted her head because humans were supposed to be terrified of the Krillians, but this one seemed merely curious. They stood there studying each other for a long moment, and Katie noticed that the princess moved with a fluid grace that seemed to ignore the laws of physics, while Zalara observed how the human stood straight despite exhaustion and how her eyes never stopped taking in details of her surroundings. Zalara spoke first and explained that Katie had violated Krillian space, and by law she should be executed or enslaved. But something about finding a lone human floating in space made her curious, and she wanted to understand why Katie had taken such a risk. Katie told the truth because lying seemed pointless, and she explained that humanity had just discovered faster than light travel, and they were trying to understand their place in a galaxy that suddenly seemed very crowded and very dangerous, and they needed information to survive. The princess listened, and then did something unexpected by laughing, and it sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, and she said that humans were either very brave or very foolish to send a single scout to spy on an empire that had conquered 40 systems. Katie replied that humans were probably both brave and foolish, but they were also stubborn, and they would not simply accept subjugation without understanding who was demanding it and why. And this made Zalara laugh again because no species had ever spoken to her with such casual defiance. Instead of throwing Katie in a cell, Zalara led her to an observation deck, where the stars spread out like diamonds on black velvet, and she asked Katie to tell her about Earth and humans, and their strange little civilization that dared to challenge the order of things. Katie talked for hours about blue skies and green forests and oceans that covered most of their world, and she explained how humans had nearly destroyed themselves multiple times, but always found a way to survive and grow stronger, and how they made art and music from their pain and joy. Zalara listened with fascination because Krillian society was built on order and logic, and the idea of creating beauty for its own sake was foreign to her. And when Katie hummed a simple melody from Earth, the princess asked her to sing it properly. The song was nothing special, just something Katie's mother had sung to her as a child. But when she finished, Zalara's eyes were wet with tears. She did not know she could cry. And she asked how humans could create something so beautiful from just sound. And emotion days passed, and Katie expected to be interrogated or tortured, but instead, Zalara came to her quarters every day with questions about humanity and their history and their dreams, and Katie found herself looking forward to these visits more than she should have. She taught Zalara about human concepts like friendship and loyalty and love, and the princess struggled to understand how humans could feel so deeply for others, even strangers. And Katie explained that it was perhaps their greatest weakness but also their greatest strength. Zalara shared her own culture in return, and told Katie about the rigid hierarchy of Krillian society and how she as princess was expected to be perfect and emotionless, and how she had never questioned this until she heard human music and stories that made her feel things she had no words for. One evening, Zalara brought Katie to a viewing port that showed the Krillian homeworld and its 3 moons, and she said that her father, the Emperor, had decided that humanity must prove their worth in combat or be conquered, and Katie's heart sank, because she knew humans could not match Krillian technology. But then Zalara touched Katie's hand with one of her 4 hands, and said that individual combat was also acceptable under their laws, and if a human could defeat their champion, then humanity would be recognized as equals, and Katie knew what she had to do. The princess tried to talk her out of it because the champion had never lost, and he was enhanced with technology that made him nearly invincible, but Katie smiled and said that humans had a long history of fighting impossible odds, and sometimes winning through sheer determination. That night, Zalara came to Katie's quarters, and they sat together in silence watching the stars wheel past, and finally the princess asked why Katie would risk everything for people who would never know her name, and Katie said because it was the right thing to do. Zalara leaned closer and whispered that she did not want Katie to die, and Katie turned to look at her and saw something in those alien eyes that transcended species, and she reached out and touched Zalara's face gently and said she would not lose. The kiss that followed was awkward because their mouths were shaped differently, but it was also perfect because it was honest, and when they pulled apart, Zalara promised that no matter what happened, she would make sure Katie's sacrifice meant something. The next morning, Katie stood in the preparation chamber putting on the basic armor they had given her while 50,000 beings gathered in the arena to watch a human face certain death. And she thought about Zalara and smiled because love was worth fighting for even across the stars. The news spread across the galaxy faster than light itself, and every species from the methane breathers of Titan 7 to the silicon beings of the Crystal Nebula talked about the human who had defeated the Krillian champion and won the heart of their princess. Katie woke in a medical bay that was too bright and too white, and the first thing she saw was Zalara sleeping in a chair beside her bed with 2 of her arms resting on the mattress, and Katie reached out and took one of her hands, which made the princess wake immediately. Zalara's eyes filled with relief, and she explained that Katie had been unconscious for 3 days while the medical systems repaired her broken ribs and internal bleeding, and Katie laughed, which hurt but was worth it because she was alive and humanity was free. The door opened and the Emperor entered, which made Katie try to sit up, but Zalara pushed her back down gently, and her father approached slowly and looked at the human who had changed everything. He thought he knew about the universe. He spoke carefully and said that Katie had earned his respect and the respect of the Empire, but more importantly, she had taught him that his daughter was right about strength, having many forms, and he formally welcomed humanity to the galactic community as equals. Katie thanked him and he almost smiled before saying that there was still the matter of his daughter declaring her love for a human in front of the entire Empire, and this would have consequences that none of them could fully predict yet. Zalara stood and faced her father with determination, and said she would not take back her words because they were true, and if the Empire could not accept love between species, then perhaps the Empire needed to change and not her feelings. The Emperor looked at his daughter and saw strength he had never noticed before, and he nodded slowly and said that change was perhaps overdue, and then he left them alone, and Katie could have sworn she saw approval in his ancient eyes. Over the following weeks, Katie became the most famous human in the galaxy, and messages poured in from Earth where the government was trying to understand how their scout had managed to secure humanity's place among the stars through single combat and love. She gave interviews to alien media who wanted to understand humans better, and she explained that humans were not special because they were strong or smart, but because they could find connections with anyone and anything, and this made them dangerous in the best way. Zalara stayed by her side through everything, and they learned to navigate their differences, like how Zalara needed much less sleep, and how Katie needed more protein in her diet, and how their different number of arms made holding hands an interesting puzzle. The first official delegation from Earth arrived 2 months later, and they were overwhelmed by the Krillian technology and culture, but Katie helped bridge the gap and showed them that aliens were not so different when you looked past the surface. Her commander pulled her aside and offered her any position she wanted in the new Galactic Diplomatic Corps, but Katie surprised him by saying she wanted to stay on the Krillian homeworld as permanent ambassador because this was where she was needed. Most Zalara introduced Katie to the common people of her world, and they were suspicious at first because humans were so strange and small, but Katie won them over by learning their language and trying their food even when it made her sick and showing genuine interest in their lives. The champion she had defeated became an unexpected friend, and he visited often to learn human fighting techniques, and he admitted that losing to her was the best thing that had happened to him because it freed him from the burden of being unbeatable. 6 months after the fight, Katie stood in the Imperial Garden with Zalara and watched 3 moons rise over purple mountains, and Zalara asked if Katie missed Earth, and Katie said yes, but that home was wherever Zalara was now. They were interrupted by a young Krillian child who approached nervously and asked Katie if it was true that humans could bond with anything. And Katie knelt down and said yes and asked if the child wanted to be friends, and the child's 4 eyes went wide with wonder. That moment was captured by a journalist and became the most shared image in galactic history because it showed a human and a Krillian child touching hands and smiling, and it represented everything that was possible when fear was replaced with curiosity. The Emperor announced that marriage between species would be legally recognized, and that Katie and Zalara would be the first to use this new law, and the ceremony would blend human and Krillian traditions in ways no one had imagined before. Scientists from both species began working together and discovered that humans' unique ability to pack bond was not just psychological, but had a quantum component that actually affected probability and luck, which explained why humans succeeded against impossible odds. Katie taught Krillian children human games like hide-and-seek and tag, which had never existed in their rigid society, and soon laughter could be heard in places that had been silent for centuries, and parents discovered their children were happier. Zalara learned to paint from Katie, and her 4 arms allowed her to create art that no human could make, and she painted the story of their love on the walls of the Imperial Palace where it would inspire generations to come. A year later, Katie stood before the Galactic Council as humanity official representative, and she proposed that Earth become a neutral meeting ground for all species because humans' unique ability to connect with anyone made them perfect mediators. The proposal passed unanimously, and soon alien ships filled Earth's skies, and human children grew up thinking it was normal to have friends with scales, or tentacles, or crystalline bodies, and the galaxy became smaller and warmer. Zalara and Katie built a home that was part human and part Krillian, with rooms for visitors from any species, and it became a symbol of what was possible when love refused to recognize boundaries or limitations. They faced challenges because some beings on both sides thought their relationship was wrong, but they faced them together, and every challenge overcome made their bond stronger and proved that love was indeed the strongest force in the universe. Years passed, and Katie's hair turned gray while Zalara remained unchanged because Krillians lived much longer than humans, but they did not waste time worrying about the future, and instead lived each day fully and completely. Katie wrote a book about her experiences, and it was translated into 10,000 languages and became required reading in schools across the galaxy because it taught that courage was not the absence of fear, but love in action. When young humans asked Katie how she had been so brave in that arena, she always smiled and said she was not brave but simply in love, and that love made ordinary people capable of extraordinary things. The arena where Katie had fought was converted into a museum, and beings from across the galaxy came to stand where history had changed, and where love had conquered prejudice and fear, and where humanity had proven they belonged among the stars. And in the center of that museum stood a statue of a human and a Krillian princess embracing, while the words that changed everything were inscribed below in every known language in the galaxy, saying simply that love was the only force that truly mattered. Katie and Zalara grew old together, or at least Katie grew old while Zalara stayed young. But their love never dimmed, and when Katie finally passed away centuries later, the entire galaxy mourned the human who had taught them all how to love. Princess Zalara never took another partner, and spent her remaining centuries spreading Katie's message of connection and love, and she established the Katie Morgan Foundation, which helped beings from different species find common ground and build friendships across the stars. 5 years had passed since the Void Hunters became protectors, and Katie was sitting in her garden on the Krillian homeworld when the doctor delivered news that should have been impossible because she was pregnant, and humans and Krillians could not have children together. Zala's forearms trembled when she heard the news, and she touched Katie's stomach gently and whispered that science said this could not happen. But Katie laughed and said that humans had always been good at doing impossible things, especially when love was involved. The Emperor called in every scientist and doctor in the Empire, and they all said the same thing, that this pregnancy defied every law of biology they knew. But the life growing inside Katie was real and healthy, and somehow perfectly balanced between both species. News spread across the galaxy like wildfire, and some beings celebrated while others feared what this might mean, and religious groups claimed it was either a miracle or an abomination. But Katie and Zalara only cared about their child. The pregnancy was difficult because Katie's body had to adapt to carrying a hybrid that needed different nutrients and had a different growth rate, and Zalara never left her side and sang Krillian lullabies, while Katie hummed Earth songs to her belly. Lisa, the engineer who had become their close friend, built a special medical monitoring system that combined human and Krillian technology, and she said this baby would be the first true citizen of the United Galaxy, and that was worth protecting. The Void Hunters sent a delegation with gifts that were strange and beautiful, and they said this child was proof that the impossible became possible when beings chose connection over separation, and they pledged to protect the child always. 3 months into the pregnancy, Katie started having dreams that were not her own, and she saw colors that did not exist and heard music that came from nowhere, and the doctors realized the baby was somehow telepathic and was sharing experiences. Zalara could feel the baby too when she touched Katie, and she cried the first time she felt their child reach out with a mind that was both human and Krillian, and something entirely new, and she knew their love had created something unprecedented. The champion visited often and brought toys and weapons because he could not decide which the child would need, and Katie laughed and said, maybe both or maybe neither, and that was the beauty of not knowing what came next. Halfway through the pregnancy, an extremist group tried to attack Katie because they believed the hybrid child was an abomination that would corrupt both species. But the attempt failed because beings from 20 different species formed a protective barrier. The leader of the extremists was brought before Katie, and he expected anger. But she invited him to feel the baby kick. And when he reluctantly placed his hand on her stomach and felt life moving inside, he began to cry and understood that fear had blinded him. The pregnancy lasted 11 months, which was longer than human normal but shorter than Krillian standard. And when labor began, every medical expert in the galaxy was watching through video links and holding their breath collectively. The birth was hard and long, and there were moments when everyone thought they would lose both mother and child. But Katie held on with human stubbornness and Zalara's strength, and after 30 hours, their daughter was born. She was perfect and impossible, with skin that shimmered faintly like her Krillian mother, but with only 2 arms like her human mother, and eyes that held stars but were shaped like Earth eyes, and she cried with a voice that sang. They named her Hope, because that was what she represented. And when the announcement was made, the entire galaxy seemed to pause and then erupted in celebration, because this child was proof that unity was not just political, but could be biological. Hope grew faster than human children, but slower than Krillian youth, and she could eat both Earth food and Krillian cuisine. And she laughed at jokes from any culture and cried when any being was sad. Near her by age 2, Hope was speaking 3 languages and showing abilities no one expected, like being able to calm angry beings just by touching them and seeing solutions to problems that others missed, and loving without any concept of species differences. Katie and Zalara had to invent new ways of parenting because no book existed for raising a hybrid child, and they made mistakes, but Hope was patient with them and taught them as much as they taught her. The Emperor, who had become a doting grandfather, said Hope changed his understanding of what strength meant because she was gentle, but unbreakable, and kind but fierce when protecting others, and wise beyond her years, but still played with toys. Other mixed couples across the galaxy began reporting pregnancies that should have been impossible, and scientists realized that Hope was Not a miracle, but an evolution, and that life found ways to bridge gaps when love built the foundation. Hope attended a school with children from every known species, and she made friends with all of them. And when older children said she did not belong anywhere, she said she belonged everywhere, and that was even better. Katie watched her daughter play with a void hunter youngling and a crystalline child and a gaseous being all at once, and she knew this was the future where children would grow up thinking diversity was normal and beautiful. Zalara taught Hope to paint with her two hands and to see colors beyond human or Krillian perception, and Hope created art that made viewers weep because it showed them unity they had never imagined possible. When Hope was 5, she stood before the Galactic Council and sang a song she had composed that somehow harmonized with every species' auditory range, and the Council voted unanimously to make it the anthem of the unified galaxy. The extremist groups faded away because it was hard to hate when children like Hope existed, and showed that mixing did not mean losing identity but gaining richness and depth that neither species could achieve. Alone, Katie grew older, while Zalara remained young. But Hope aged at her own pace, and she carried the best of both her mothers, including Katie determination and Zalara grace, and something uniquely her own that was pure love. Scientists studied Hope respectfully and discovered that her DNA was not just a mix but a harmony, and that her cells could adapt to any environment, and her immune system recognized all life as familiar rather than foreign. The champion became Hope's favorite uncle and taught her to fight, not because she needed to, but because discipline and strength were gifts worth having, and she learned to be gentle with her power because true strength protected others. When Hope was 7, she asked why some beings had been afraid of her before she was born, and Katie explained. That fear of difference was old and powerful, but love was older and more powerful, and Hope said she would teach everyone to love. The Void Hunters created a lullaby for Hope that sounded like whale songs mixed with stellar wind, and she was the first child in galactic history to fall asleep to music from civilizations that had once been mortal enemies. Hope became a symbol, but Katie and Zalara made sure she was a child first and a symbol second, and they gave her chores and bedtimes and rules because being special did not mean being spoiled. And every night when they tucked Hope into bed, she would hold both her mother's hands and say she loved them to the edge of the universe and back, and they knew their love had created something that would change everything forever. 3 years after the famous arena fight, Katie and Zalara faced their first real crisis when a fleet of ships appeared at the edge of Krillian space, and these ships belonged to the Void Hunters who consumed entire civilizations and had never been defeated. The emergency meeting of the Galactic Council was held on Earth for the first time, and representatives from 40 species gathered in the massive dome that humans had built in what used to be called New York, and fear filled the room. Like smoke, Katie sat beside Zalara as they listened to reports of worlds that had gone dark and populations that had vanished without trace, and the Void Hunters were coming toward the core systems, and nobody had weapons that could stop them. The Krillian Emperor suggested they evacuate what they could and run, but Katie stood up and said that running was not an option, because if they ran now, they would run forever, and humans had learned that sometimes you had to make a stand. The council argued for hours, and some species wanted to fight while others wanted to hide and others wanted to negotiate. But Katie noticed that no one was asking the right question, which was why the Void Hunters did what they did. Zalara supported Katie when she proposed something insane, which was to send a small ship to make contact and try to understand the Void Hunters before fighting them. And the council thought this was madness, but Katie volunteered to go herself. The Emperor forbade his daughter from joining the suicide mission, but Zalara stood tall and said she would go where Katie went, and their bond was not just personal but symbolic of unity between species, and they would face this threat together. They took a small ship with a crew of 12 beings from different species, including the champion who had become their friend, and a human engineer named Lisa, and a crystalline mathematician, and others who believed in trying before fighting. The journey to meet the Void Hunter fleet took 2 weeks, and every night Katie and Zalara held each other and talked about everything, except the fact they might not come back. And their love was a warm light in the cold darkness of space. When they finally found the Void Hunter fleet, it was worse than anyone imagined, because the ships were not ships but living creatures the size of moons with tentacles that could crack planets and eyes that burned with hunger that had lasted eons. Katie broadcast a message on every frequency saying, "They came in peace to understand and talk, and for a long moment nothing happened." And then one of the smaller creatures approached their tiny ship, and Katie felt Zalara's 4 hands grip hers tightly. The creature did not attack, but instead scanned them with energy that made everyone sick, and then it projected thoughts directly into their minds, and the thoughts were ancient and lonely, and full of a sadness that stretched back millions of years. Katie realized the Void Hunters were not hunters at all, but were searching for something they had lost so long ago they could not remember what it was, and they consumed civilizations hoping to find it, but never did, and this made them angry and desperate. She asked them what they were looking for, and the creature projected images of a world that had been beautiful before something destroyed it, and Katie understood they were the last of their kind looking for home that no longer existed. Zalara had an idea, and she shared her memory of the first time she heard human music and how it had made her feel things she had no words for. And the creature went still, and then asked to hear more. Lisa, the engineer, had brought her guitar, because humans brought music everywhere, and she played a simple song about home and family and love, and the massive creature began to shake, and Katie realized it was crying in its own way. The song spread through the fleet as the creatures shared it with each other, and for the first time in eons they remembered what beauty was and what they had lost and what they had become in their loneliness and grief. Katie offered them something no one had thought to offer before, which was a place to belong, and she said the galaxy was vast and there were empty systems where they could build new homes and they did not have to be alone anymore. The creatures were suspicious because they had been feared and hated for so long, but Zalara stepped forward and said that if humans could love Krillians, and Krillians could love humans, then the galaxy could learn to accept Void Hunters too. It took days of talking and sharing, and Katie taught them human games while Zalara showed them Krillian art and Lisa played music, and slowly the creatures began to remember they had once been more than destroyers. The leader of the Void Hunters asked why they should trust these small beings, and Katie said because trust had to start somewhere, and she extended her hand toward a tentacle that could crush her ship and waited. The contact was electric and painful and beautiful all at once, and the creature saw through Katie's eyes how the galaxy could be if fear was replaced with understanding, and it saw her love for Zalara and realized that connection was what they had been searching for. They returned to the council with 3 Void Hunter representatives, and the panic was immediate. But Katie stood before everyone and explained that the greatest threats often came from loneliness and isolation, and the solution was not weapons but welcome. It took months of negotiation and fear and setbacks, but eventually the Void Hunters were given 3 systems on the edge of inhabited space, and they began to build instead of destroy, and their ships became guardians of the outer borders Zalara. And Katie visited them often and brought music and art and stories, and the Void Hunters learned to create instead of consume. And their tentacled forms began to seem less terrifying and more just different. The champion started a fighting school where beings from all species could learn from each other. And he said Katie had taught him that real strength was knowing when not to fight, and the school became famous across the galaxy. A young Void Hunter asked Katie how she had been brave enough to reach out first, and Katie said she had learned from Zalara that love meant taking risks and that connection was worth any danger it might bring. The Galactic Council created a new position called Ambassador, a first contact, and gave it to Katie because she had proven that humans' greatest gift was their ability to see potential friends where others saw only enemies. Zalara painted the moment of first contact on the largest wall of the council chamber, and it showed Katie's small hand reaching toward the massive tentacle, and it reminded everyone that size and shape meant nothing compared to intent years later. When historians wrote about how the galaxy avoided war with the Void Hunters, they said, it started with a guitar and a song and 2 beings who believed love could cross any divide. And they were right. Katie and Zalara became known as the Bridge Builders, and whenever a new species was discovered or when old enemies needed mediation, they were called because everyone knew they would find connection where others found only conflict. The Void Hunters became the galaxy's most loyal protectors, and when asked why they had changed, they always said it was because one human had seen them not as monsters, but as beings capable of love, and that had made all the difference. And in the quiet moments when Katie and Zalara sat together watching stars, they did not see as alien anymore. They knew that every connection they built made the universe smaller and warmer and more like home for everyone. The arena was larger than any stadium on Earth, and Katie walked through the tunnel toward the light knowing that 50,000 aliens waited to see her die, and she could hear their voices like thunder echoing off the metal walls. But she kept walking because stopping was not an option. Princess Zalara sat in the royal viewing box and her 4 hands gripped each other tightly, while her father, the Emperor, sat beside her with no expression on his face, and she wanted to scream that this was wrong, but she knew it would change nothing because the law was the law. Katie entered the arena, and the crowd noise hit her like a physical force, but she stood tall in the center of the sandy floor and looked up at the viewing box where she could see Zalara's shimmering form, and their eyes met across the impossible distance, and Katie nodded once. The opposite gate opened and the champion emerged, and Katie understood why no one had ever beaten him, because he was 12 feet of muscle and armor and rage, with 4 arms like Zalara, but covered in scales that looked harder than steel and eyes that held no mercy. The crowd roared their approval as their champion raised all 4 arms and weapons materialized in each hand, and Katie had only been given a simple staff and basic armor, because humans had no advanced weapons that were approved for the ritual combat. The Emperor stood, and his voice boomed across the arena as he announced that this human would face their champion to determine if humanity deserved respect or subjugation, and he asked Katie if she understood that death was the most likely outcome, and she said yes clearly. Zalara closed her eyes for a moment because she could not bear to watch, but then opened them again because Katie deserved to have someone who cared watching her final moments, and she saw Katie's lips move in what might have been a prayer, or might have been her name. The champion moved first, and he was impossibly fast for something so large, and his first strike would have cut Katie in half if she had not dropped and rolled at the exact right moment, and the crowd gasped because no one had ever avoided his opening attack completely. Katie came up running, and she moved in patterns. That made no sense to the watching aliens because humans had evolved as persistence hunters who could run their prey to exhaustion, and she was not trying to match his strength, but to make him work for every swing. The champion spun with all 4 arms extended, and his weapons created a wall of death. But Katie dropped flat and swept her staff at his ankles, and he stumbled just slightly, but it was enough to show he was not invincible, and the crowd murmured in confusion. Zalara stood up without meaning to, and several guards moved closer to her, but she ignored them and watched as Katie danced away from another devastating attack, and she noticed that Katie was not getting tired, while the champion was starting to breathe harder. The fight continued, and Katie took hits that would have killed most species, but humans had redundant organs and shock absorption that evolved from falling out of trees, and she kept getting back up with blood running down her face but still smiling. The champion grew frustrated because nothing he had fought had ever lasted this long, and his attacks became wider and more aggressive, and Katie saw the pattern and waited for her moment. And when it came, she did not hesitate. She threw her staff like a spear, and it hit the champion in his lower left shoulder joint where the armor plates met, and he roared in pain and dropped one weapon, and Katie was already moving, and she leaped onto his back before he could recover. The crowd screamed as Katie wrapped her arms around the champion's throat and her legs around his torso, and held on with grip strength that came from ancestors who had to hold onto tree branches, and the champion spun and struck at her but could not reach her properly. Zalara was running before she realized she had left her seat, and she pushed past her father guards and ran down the stairs while the crowd watched their champion slam backwards into the arena wall, trying to dislodge the small human who would not let go. Katie felt her ribs crack from the impact, but she held on because this was not about strength but about will. And humans had survived everything Earth could throw at them, through pure, stubborn refusal to give up, and she would not give up now. The champion dropped to his knees and his movements became sluggish, and Katie adjusted her grip to a blood choke she had learned in basic training, and she whispered that he should surrender because she did not want to kill him. And unconsciousness was only seconds away. He tapped the ground 3 times, which was the universal signal of surrender, and Katie immediately released him and stepped back, and the arena fell completely silent because their champion had never surrendered, and a human had done the impossible with nothing but determination. Zalara reached the barrier at the edge of the arena floor, and she vaulted over it with grace that defied physics, and ran across the sand toward Katie, who was standing over the fallen champion with her hand extended to help him up. The princess reached Katie just as the champion took her offered hand and stood, and he looked at this small creature who had defeated him and said that humans were worthy opponents. And then he walked away with more respect than shame. Zalara grabbed Katie with all four arms and pulled her close, not caring that 50,000 beings were watching, and Katie blood was staining her perfect dress, and she examined Katie injuries with hands that shook from relief. The Emperor voice echoed across the silent arena, demanding to know what his daughter was doing, and Zalara turned to face him while still holding Katie, and her voice was carried by every amplifier as she spoke the words that would change everything. She said that Katie Morgan had proven humanity deserved respect, but more than that, she had proven that strength came in many forms and that the galaxy had been wrong to judge by size or technology alone. And then she said the words that truly mattered: "I love you, human." The complete silence that followed was so absolute that Katie could hear her own heartbeat, and the entire arena seemed frozen in time. And then Katie reached up and touched Zalara's face and said, "I love you too," and kissed her. One being in the crowd began to clap slowly, and then another joined, and then dozens, and then hundreds, and then thousands, until the entire arena shook with applause, because they had witnessed something beyond a simple fight. The Emperor stood in his box and looked down at his daughter holding a human who had blood on her face, but victory in her eyes. And he raised his staff and declared that humanity would be welcomed as equals in the galactic community. Later historians would mark this moment as when the galaxy truly became united, not through force or fear, but through the simple act of two beings from different worlds, choosing love over everything else that separated them. Katie leaned against Zalara and whispered that she had kept her promise, and Zalara held her tighter and said she never doubted it, and around them 50,000 beings cheered for the human who had won using the most human weapon of all, which was the refusal to give up. The princess helped Katie walk from the arena, and behind them the champion stood and bowed deeply because he had learned something valuable about humans, and it was that they were far more dangerous than anyone had imagined, because they fought with their hearts. That night, as medical systems healed Katie injuries, Zalara stayed by her side, and they talked about the future and how everything had changed, and Katie said that love had always been humanity's greatest strength, and now the galaxy knew it too.